She did not just become famous, she became a face people could not stop staring at. And that was the beginning of the problem. Before the lawsuits, before the accusations, before her name started circling through headlines that sounded more like warnings than praise, Jingyi had already been turned into something dangerous in the public eye. Not just a celebrity, but an image too polished, too perfect, too carefully admired to remain human for long. That is how stories like hers begin, not with scandal, with worship. Long before the internet started questioning her, it was obsessed with her. Jingyi rose through SNH48, the Chinese idol group system that knew exactly how to package ambition, beauty, and competition into something irresistible. In that world, attention was not given kindly. It was fought for, ranked, measured, publicly displayed. Every performance mattered. Every vote mattered. Every face had to hold its place under the harsh logic of visibility. And somehow, Jingyi did more than survive it. She stood out so sharply that the audience stopped seeing her as one idol among many. They began seeing her as something else entirely, a phenomenon, a fantasy, a face built to be remembered. That is where her rise became bigger than a normal success story. Because Jingyi was not only becoming popular, she was becoming symbolic. The more people watched her, the more her image hardened into a kind of myth. Elegant, delicate, almost unreal. She won major rankings inside SNH48, built a powerful fandom, and became one of the defining names to come out of that idol system. But the higher that image rose, the less space there was for her to be ordinary. Fame gave her status. It also quietly took something away. Complexity. Once the public decides your face means something, it stops asking who you really are. And Jingyi's face meant too much too quickly. It was not just that she was beautiful. Plenty of celebrities are beautiful. What changed everything was the way beauty became the center of her narrative. The media leaned into it. The internet magnified it. The audience repeated it until it no longer sounded like a compliment, but a brand. She was framed as ethereal, rare, almost too stunning to belong to the real world. For a while, that kind of attention looked like power. Maybe it was, but it was also a trap disguised as adoration. Because when a woman becomes famous for seeming perfect, people do not simply praise her. They begin auditing her, every angle, every feature, every expression, every shift. And that pressure followed her when she stepped beyond idol fame and into acting. By then, Jingyi was no longer just a former group star trying to build a second career. She was a public image under constant inspection. Her dramas expanded her reach, her popularity deepened, and her visual identity became even more fixed in the minds of viewers. She was not being watched casually anymore, she was being studied. People talked about her styling, her makeup, her camera presence, the consistency of her beauty, the way she seemed to arrive on screen already perfected. The more flawless she looked, the more aggressive the public gaze became. That is the contradiction at the center of her story. The image that helped make her famous also made her vulnerable, because perfection never calms the audience, it provokes it. At first, the fascination looked harmless, compliments, viral clips, awe. But fascination rarely stays innocent for long. It eventually turns into suspicion. The public begins to wonder whether beauty that polished can possibly be natural, whether poise that controlled can possibly be effortless, whether the person behind the face is as real as the image being sold. And once those doubts begin, they do not stay small, they spread, they sharpen. They wait for a crack. Jingyi's rise was dazzling, yes, but it also built the exact conditions that would make her later story explosive. Because by the time controversy entered the picture, the public was no longer reacting to a normal celebrity. It was reacting to a woman it had already placed on a pedestal so high that even the slightest tremor would feel like a collapse. And Jingyi was about to learn the cruelest rule of that kind of fame. The more perfect the image, the more people want to be there when it breaks. Perfection is never enough for the public, it only makes them look closer. That was the next phase of Jingyi's story. After the rise, after the idol rankings, after the face that seemed too polished to forget, came something colder than admiration. Scrutiny. The kind that does not simply watch a celebrity succeed, but waits for proof that the success is artificial. And Jingyi was the perfect target for that kind of attention, because by then, her image had become almost too clean, too controlled, too visually complete to escape suspicion. She was no longer just a former idol building a new career. She was becoming a screen presence, a recurring fantasy, a woman whose face arrived before the performance did. As her acting work pulled in more viewers, the conversation around her shifted in a way that should have felt flattering, but never really was. People did not just say she was beautiful, they said it with disbelief, with obsession, with the tone people use when admiration is starting to become an accusation. Because once the public decides someone is almost unreal, it begins asking a dangerous question. What part of this is fake? And that question followed Jingyi everywhere. It followed her into every close-up, every red carpet look, every historical costume, every carefully lit still frame that made her seem more like an artwork than a person. Her beauty was no longer just one aspect of her fame. It was the center of the argument around her. To some people, she was mesmerizing. To others, she was too polished, too curated, too intentionally composed to be trusted. The same image that made her magnetic also made people restless. They did not want to just admire it. They wanted to test it, pull it apart, find the mechanism behind the illusion. That is what happens when a woman becomes famous for seeming perfect. The public stops consuming her career and starts investigating her face. And with Jingyi, that investigation never really ended. People talked about her styling, her makeup, the way her visuals seemed almost untouched by bad angles or bad lighting. They talked about whether her beauty was natural, whether it was constructed, whether the person on screen was still a person at all, or a kind of perfected design. It was the cruelest trap imaginable. If she appeared effortlessly beautiful, she was accused of being manufactured. If she leaned into the fantasy, she was called artificial. If she remained distant, she was cold. If she explained nothing, silence itself became suspicious. The public had fallen in love with the image. Then it became angry that the image would not confess how it was made. And maybe that was the moment Jingyi's story stopped being about fame and started becoming about projection. Because the audience was no longer reacting to what she did. It was reacting to what she represented. She became a screen onto which people projected insecurity, fascination, resentment, desire, and doubt. They wanted her to remain beautiful, but not impossibly beautiful. They wanted her to remain elegant, but not so controlled that it felt unreachable. They wanted her to stay special, but also explain herself enough to feel accessible. That contradiction is impossible to survive cleanly. The more Jingyi's image held together, the more people searched for the fracture. And when they could not find one easily, they became even more certain one had to exist. That is why her public narrative grew heavier over time. Not because she suddenly changed into someone scandalous, but because the pressure around her image had been building for years. Every compliment carried tension inside it. Every viral photo carried suspicion. Every appearance deepened the same feeling, that the public was no longer simply watching her career unfold, but circling her like it was waiting for the beautiful myth to slip. And when a celebrity reaches that point, controversy does not arrive as a surprise. It arrives like something the audience has been preparing for all along. Because the truth was, Jingyi had already become too perfect to be left in peace. The real drama did not begin when people questioned Jingyi's face. It began when the woman behind that face started fighting for control. By the time her story reached this stage, the public had already spent years staring at Jingyi as if she were an image first and a person second. They had debated her beauty, dissected her screen presence, and built an entire mythology around the idea that she was too polished to be ordinary. But image-based scrutiny is only one kind of pressure. The more dangerous kind begins when a star is no longer just managing public opinion, but trying to break free from the machinery that helped create that opinion in the first place. That is where Jingyi's story stopped looking like a fairy tale and started looking like a fight. Because once an idol becomes valuable enough, the battle is no longer only about popularity, it becomes about ownership. Who built the star? Who controls the name? Who profits from the face, the career, the schedule, the next era? And for someone like Jingyi, someone whose image had become incredibly marketable, that question was never going to stay quiet forever. Her conflict with her former management side did not feel like an ordinary contract disagreement. It felt like something darker in tone, because by then the public already understood what was at stake. This was not just paperwork, not just clauses and signatures. This was a struggle over narrative, leverage, and power. The woman who had once been packaged, promoted, and elevated within an idol system was now moving into a far more dangerous phase, trying to define herself outside of it. And that is always when the industry turns colder, because systems are comfortable with stars they can present. They are less comfortable with stars who want independence. The moment that tension became visible, Jingyi's public story changed again. She was no longer just the beautiful actress people argued about online. She was becoming the center of a conflict that made her image feel more brittle, more contested, more exposed. Reports, accusations, denials, public noise. Suddenly the discussion around her was no longer about whether she looked too perfect. It was about whether the polished image had been hiding a much uglier struggle behind the scenes. That is what made this phase so dramatic. Not the legal language itself, not the corporate statements, but the feeling that something had cracked open. For years, Jingyi had existed in the public imagination like a finished product, elegant, composed, almost untouchable. But disputes like these ruin that illusion. They drag celebrity back into the world of power, money, control, and fear. They remind people that behind every carefully lit image, there may be contracts, pressure, resentment, and people fighting over who gets to own the future. And once that enters the story, the audience looks at everything differently, because the public can accept beauty. It can even accept controversy. What fascinates it most is the moment beauty and controversy collide. And with Jingyi, that collision was beginning to look impossible to ignore. The face that once seemed too perfect to question was now standing inside a narrative that felt far messier than the image ever suggested. And that was when the pedestal started to shake. What made Jingyi's story so compelling was never just the scandal, it was the contrast. The distance between the woman the public thought it knew and the reality that kept slipping out from underneath that image. For years, Jingyi had been framed almost like an untouchable fantasy, too beautiful, too polished, too controlled to seem fully real. People stared at her as if perfection itself were her identity, and maybe that was always the cruelest part of her fame. The more flawless the image became, the less room there was for her to exist outside it. Then the noise changed. The conversation was no longer just about beauty, styling, or whether her image felt too curated to be natural. It became louder, darker, and harder to contain. Disputes with her former management, public accusations, waves of speculation, and that constant sense that something larger was happening behind the scenes. It all pushed her story into a different category. She was no longer just a celebrity people admired from a distance. She was now a figure standing in the middle of a struggle the public could sense, even if it could not fully see. And that is when an image becomes fragile. Because audiences are comfortable worshipping perfection. What they do not know how to handle is the moment perfection starts looking cornered. Suddenly, every silence feels loaded. Every appearance feels strategic. Every comeback feels like both a return and a test. With Jingyi, that tension became part of the fascination. People were no longer just looking at her face. They were looking for signs: weakness, defiance, control, fear. Anything that might explain what was really happening beneath the surface. But maybe that is the real story. Not whether every accusation was true, not whether every headline captured the full truth. But the fact that Jingyi had reached a point where the public could no longer see her as something simple. The perfect image had cracked, not necessarily into ruin, but into something more human, more unstable, and far more difficult to control. And maybe that is what makes her different now. She is no longer just the beautiful myth people projected onto. She is also the woman who exposed how dangerous that myth could become. Because in the end, Jingyi's story was never only about beauty. It was about what happens when beauty becomes a cage, fame becomes a battlefield, and the person inside the image starts fighting to be seen as more than the fantasy everyone else preferred. That was the moment the fairy tale ended, and the real story began.